Discourse. I am Tyler Frater. Today I have a very special guest. Tori Olsson is the Associate Professor of History and Director of Graduate Studies of American History at the University of Tennessee. His recently published book is Red Dead's History, a Video Game, an Obsession, and America's Violent Past. Tori, thank you so much for joining me this morning and talking a little bit of Red Dead and a little bit of American history.
Yeah. Hey, Tyler. Thanks so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
So, at the University of Tennessee, you taught a class based on Red Dead Redemption, and then you went on to write the book. That sort of was a recap of the class for like a wider audience. That experience must have been because you then went on to Comic-Con and you had a book signing and you got to meet Roger Clark, who plays Arthur Morgan in the game, and he even did the voice for the audiobook, which is kind of crazy to listen to. So we'll get into all that in a bit because there's a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss. How I would like to begin though is just ask you, how did your interest in history start? Where did you gain a passion for learning and teaching history?
Yeah, absolutely. So it's been going on for a long time. This is not a recent obsession of mine. So I'm an immigrant. I was born and raised in Sweden and moved to the U.S. to start third grade over in Massachusetts, where I grew up. And coming from Sweden, American history was just this like intensely fascinating thing, in part because it was so different from Swedish history. It was just so much more dramatic. I mean, I shouldn't say that. Swedish history is interesting too, but like the Civil War,
Oh yeah.
like Sweden doesn't have anything quite like that. American history, when I learned about it, it's just so tumultuous, so insane, and so otherworldly from my perspective as a European. So I got interested really early on. It was like I think in third grade, my parents gave me this set of trading cards of every president,
Oh, awesome.
and I just wore those things out. Like I was just random ragged because I was just obsessed with like where did James Madison go to law school? Like how many terms did Franklin Roosevelt serve? I don't know why I was so interested in it, but it continued throughout high school. I was just better at my English and history classes. That was kind of my field. And by the time I got to college, I thought, I don't know what to major in, but I keep doing really well in my history classes. So why not continue down that road? And of course, that addiction to college level history was so intense that I decided to go to graduate school and earn a PhD in that discipline eventually.
Yeah, which is not an easy thing to do. As someone who has a bachelor's degree, I don't know how anyone completes that and then decides I'm going to go back to school for more school. That
Well, yeah,
is not
especially
enviable.
it took me 8 years after undergrad to do the
Yeah,
PhD, two
yeah.
years for a master's, and then another six for the PhD. But I'll tell you, Tyler, it was a blast. I mean, it was
Oh
a
yeah.
ton of work, but I really enjoyed it. I mean, I don't have any regrets about that whatsoever. It was really fun.
You told the story in interviews, and I think you begin the book talking about how when you were younger you were into video games. You played Half-Life, Deus
Oh,
Ex. I think was one.
so good.
Yeah, which if we want to turn this just into a podcast about video games, we can do that. But no.
Well, so I
Um,
I had the very fortunate circumstances of coming of age as a teenager in the late 1990s. And I was a PC gamer. I always have been. That's like my platform. And in the late 90s, like that was I mean, I'm sure folks will argue with me, but I would say this is the golden age of PC gaming because think about all the different
oh yeah.
franchises that make their debut in those years when I was in high school. Like I think Quake came out right around
Yeah,
then.
early 90s, and then you
You know,
had Baldur's Gate,
yeah,
which is like the
Doom had
first.
been around,
Yep.
Warcraft,
Thief.
StarCraft,
Yep.
Half-Life, Thief, Deus Ex, Age of Empires. I mean, oh my
Yeah.
gosh, dude, like all these games that people are playing like versions 5 or 6 of, Diablo, right? Like all
Yeah.
those games came out when I was in high school. And what do you think I was doing? I was playing them all day and night. And it actually was not a good thing for me because I was a really bad student as a result of that. Like I would much rather play Diablo 2 than study for my math exam. And this meant shamefully that I squeaked out of high school with a 2.7 GPA, which was not my proudest moment as a student. I just didn't, I didn't know why I was in school. I felt like I was doing it for my parents. I'd rather be playing video games. But then when I got to college, it really changed, right? So when I got to university and I realized I was studying for myself, not for someone else, and when the classes got a whole lot more interesting, then I made this fateful decision. This is in 2000. I made this momentous decision to turn my back on the gaming world for what I assumed would be forever. Right? Like I thought I was done. I thought I was done for life. I thought I was turning my back on this sort of childish hobby and I was, getting serious, which I did. I could not have expected at that point that 20 years later, in 2020, I would dive back into gaming and have it take me in very unexpected directions. But life is weird, man.
Yeah, so you obviously discovered Red Dead Redemption. I am curious, have you tried to get back into gaming at all? Have you tried to like keep it on the outside as you
Oh, I'm
as you
back
do your
in.
Oh, you're back in. Okay. What are you playing right now? Are you
For
playing anything currently?
well, just yesterday I got a VR headset
Oh, nice.
for my PlayStation. I got the PSVR 2. So I'm dabbling around with that Horizon VR game that
Okay,
came
yeah,
out
yeah.
for
Call of the Mountain.
PS5.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty good. It made me a little motion sick this morning. I played Half-Life Alyx on VR a few years ago and loved that so much. Again, remember I played the original Half-Life in the 90s and I was obsessed with it. So anything that has head crabs, I'm all about, right? That's for sure. Yeah, so no, I've been playing, I mean, I don't have the ability to be as obsessive of a gamer now as
Yeah,
I
sure.
was in the 90s. I've
Sure.
got young children. I still have a job that keeps me busy.
Yeah.
I'm married. Like all these things I can't, I could, that make me a better person, but also mean that I can't play for 5 hours straight like I did in 1999. But no, I've played a bunch of. I mean, I'm happy to talk more about other games later on. But yeah, Red Dead 2 was the big discovery. This is very early. It's one of the very first games that I pick up after 20 years of hiatus. Like literally the 2000s and 2000 teens, I just wasn't playing games. I
Uh-huh.
was like studying, I was reading, I was writing. I wrote my first book, which is more of an academic book. And throughout all of that, like games were just a non-entity. Like I didn't know about them, I didn't care about them. It was just a buried part of my childhood. But then the pandemic hits, and I'm thinking, well, by this point, I've got tenure at my job. I've, more established in my career, and I thought, now's a good time to like dip my toes back in. So the first game I play is The Witcher 3
Oh,
back in
nice. Okay.
2020, which
Yeah.
was just it blew me away. I hadn't played anything like that. I'd never even played an open world game before,
Yeah,
like this is the
sure.
first open world game I played, and
Yeah.
it was unbelievable. But then the second game that I played was Red Dead Redemption 2, and I just picked it up for fun. Like I
Yeah.
picked it up because like, I really enjoyed Witcher 3. Let's try another open world game. I hear this one has really good graphics. And so the fact that it was a historical game was like not central to why I
Oh,
picked it up. Like I
interesting.
was picking it
Okay.
up just for fun. It was not, I could never have imagined that there would be some sort of like professional connection with this for what I do. That was unthinkable.
So you decided to base an entire class on your experience playing the game and sort of how the game portrays American history and like American history in the progressive era of 1899. Um,
Yeah.
I'm curious, how does the process in like pitching a uh, you know you're gonna decide to teach a class. I assume you can't just decide and then you have to teach the class. What's the
Yeah.
process like? Do you have to go to history faculty and like your I don't know what the
Yeah.
terms would be, your bosses, and like
Yeah, sure.
pitch the
You're absolutely
class?
right.
And how's
That's
that
exactly
process
what I
work? Yeah.
did. Yeah, it was done via email. I remember this very well. This is kind of deep pandemic. It's like, September 2020 or something. So a lot of the teaching is all online. But so I sent an email to my two hires up, my head and my associate head, the people responsible for undergraduate teaching and for the whole Department of History. And I asked them, "Hey, I've got this crazy idea. I want to teach an undergraduate upper division course that explores Gilded Age and Progressive Era American history through the lens of the most popular historical video game ever made, Red Dead Redemption. and they asked two things. They asked, "What the hell is Red Dead Redemption?" Right? Neither of them are gamers. Both of them are a little older than me. They didn't know anything about this. And then they asked, "Do you think students will sign up for the class?" And I thought, yeah, I think they will. You know? So they were really eager to have me try this. I'd been teaching with pop culture in classes previously. When I do like my big American history survey, I actually call it American History in 30 Pop Songs. And we listen to at least one song for every lecture and talk
Okay.
about it. So I've been flirting with pop culture. But of course, video games are often seen as the sort of black sheep of the
Hmm.
pop culture family. I think unfairly so
I would agree.
nowadays.
I would
In the
agree.
90s, maybe, right? But
Maybe.
like now they're the video game industry is now bigger than music and movies combined
Yeah, it's
in
very
terms of
big.
revenue.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's time for historians to be a little bit more engaged with that world. And I think a lot of the reason too why my bosses in the history department said, "Sure, give it a go," is that in the last 20 years or so, certainly in the last 10 years, we've seen a really steep decline in history majors and
Oh,
sort of
really?
enrollment in history classes at
Interesting.
universities across the country, right? This is not unique to the University of Tennessee. It's like this bigger thing. And I think there's multiple reasons behind it. There's this increasing stereotype that, oh, a history major is a useless degree. It can't get you a job. And that's total BS, right? Like there's no data that proves that
Yeah.
whatsoever.
Yeah.
But I think like in the age of smartphones, when people have Wikipedia on there, they think, oh, why would you need to know history when you can just pull up any historical fact on your phone? Of course, that doesn't, showcase the ways that history and then the humanities as a whole is
Hmm.
not memorizing names and dates and facts, but it's a way of seeing the world and really a way of seeing the world that's incredibly necessary in the times that we live in. But it's also a set of skills about argumentation and evidence and all this sort of stuff. But either way, they were eager to have me try it. And probably the smartest thing that I did before teaching the class is that I posted about it to social media. So I tweeted about it. I think it was something like, "Who says video games don't belong in the classroom? I'm an American history professor, and in the fall, I'm teaching the world's first ever college class using the Red Dead games," and that went viral.
Yeah.
And it also got picked up by the gaming press, which was cool. So like GameSpot ran a story on it.
Yeah.
It went insane on Reddit, on the Red Dead Reddit especially. And what was great is that all of this got the word out among my most important target audience, which was University of Tennessee students, right?
Sure.
So they learned about the class through social media and they signed up for it like crazy, right? So like the enrollment in this first semester was higher than anything in a class like that of its type that I've ever seen before, right? It was kind of through the roof, which was of course very exciting, right? Because I want students to get excited about history. This is what it's all about.
Yeah, I will say that when you talk about like history, and I think sometimes I'm a journalism major, and I think that's a little
Yeah.
bit of a similar case with journalism because journalism is such a there was a class when I was taking when I was in school for journalism. There was a class where the entire class was how do you make money being a journalist. The entire class was like, what do you do? But it's one
Yeah.
of those like journalism. I think history may be one of those majors or one of those areas of learning where you can apply certain things in a way that may not be obvious. Like I can tell you some of my favorite games and some of my favorite game developers were people who went to school and majored in history and then they took the things that they learned from history and then the stories that they wrote they based because history really is like the best repository for crazy stories and like
Yeah.
insane like so it's like they like
Yeah.
Pillars of Eternity. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Pillars of Eternity, but Pillars of Eternity 2 is set in sort of a it's a fantasy recreation of the Caribbean islands during like the
Hmm.
16 1700s, and it has much of the same like social background and much of the same like economic setting, and so you can tell that they sort of based it on a real thing and used some of the real themes from history and then sort of took it in a different direction with fantasy. But anyway,
Yeah.
yeah, so I
Right. So I
think
mean, I
there's
think both journalism and history and English and philosophy, they
sure.
teach you skills that don't go out of style, right? They
Yeah.
don't get outdated with the next generation of software or whatever, right?
Yeah.
They are timeless skills that are applicable in so many different kinds of fields. And to prove this point, I just want to share a short anecdote with you that you might think is very interesting. So just a few weeks ago, I had a Zoom call with Dan Houser,
Oh
who's the
yeah.
co-founder of Rockstar
Yeah.
Games, who's
Okay.
one of the lead writers on both the Grand Theft Auto and Red Dead games. He reached out to me. He said, Professor Olson, I'm
Oh
reading your
wow.
book. I
Awesome.
want to chat. So that was really fun. But this is a guy who helped build one of the biggest and most successful gaming companies. What's his background? What's his training? Is he a computer science major? No, he's a geography major,
Oh, I didn't know that.
right?
Interesting.
Oh
Oh,
yeah.
okay.
So, and he told me, like of the top leadership at Rockstar, the vast majority are not STEM people.
Hmm.
Like they studied different things. They studied more humanities and social sciences things. And think about it, what distinguishes Rockstar Games from other video games is like not only their detail and granularity, but their interest in talking about social, cultural,
Yeah. Yeah.
problems and issues. I mean, even the GTA games, right, for all their sort of silliness, are very much sort of biting critiques of American culture and
Yeah.
society. So
Yeah.
you need people who've read about the world to make games like that, right? Like they
Yes.
can't just be coders and artists and music people. Like they need the humanities and social sciences. Okay, this is an overlong love
No,
fest
no.
for
Yeah.
not. I mean, I respect STEM fields. I have
Sure. Oh
tremendous
yeah, no,
respect for
super
them.
important.
Video
Yeah.
games would never exist without
Yes.
them, but brilliant video games wouldn't exist if it wasn't for humanities and social science people.
Yeah. Yeah, video games really are fascinating because it really does take there is so much science and engineering and technicalities behind them. And then all the art you can imagine and they just mesh and how developers can make games like The Witcher 3 and Red Dead 2. I it sounds like I'm being exaggerative when I say it's a miracle, but it really almost is just to be able to get all those things put into one
Right,
package. But oh, so
right.
as far when you were deciding, so you decided to teach the class. When you were figuring out what specifically you wanted to discuss, how did you make those decisions?
Yeah.
Were you walking around the game and you just sort of things appeared to you and you're like, oh, I could teach a bunch about this, or oh, I could
Yeah,
make
yeah,
a
yeah.
lecture on like this thing over here. Like,
Right.
how did those
There were
develop?
so many possibilities, right? I could have taught 3 semesters worth of material based on the games because they touch on so many big topics.
Yeah,
So what I really decided to emphasize was topics when I really focused in on the games when they touched on topics that are usually considered huge dilemmas by historians. So things like the women's suffrage movement, like corporate capitalism, the memory of the Civil War after the war in the South, warfare between Native peoples and the U.S. Military. Like all of those would be covered in any traditional American history class in the kind of post-Civil War period. So I decided to touch on things that helped shed light on bigger structural dilemmas within the United States, right? Like I could have gone the approach like, who was the real life inspiration behind Dutch van der Linde?
hmm
Let's think a list of characters. But to me, that's actually less interesting because it doesn't help understand the bigger picture. So I wanted to avoid the sort of navel gazing, tit for tat, apples to apples, real life versus game comparisons, and instead think about, okay, well, the Pinkertons, for example, what can they tell us about the labor movement? What can they tell
sure,
us
yeah,
about the disputes between big Eastern companies and settlers in the West? So I didn't want to be like, which Pinkerton is the inspiration behind Agent Milton? I mean, there are times when I do that in the book, but that's kind of like the exception rather than the rule.
sure, yeah,
So I wanted to
yeah.
think big. Like I wanted the class to really capture the really massive towering social and cultural and economic problems of the US at that time.
Was there anything that in the class or in the book that you wish you could have covered, or a topic you think the game represents in an interesting way that you just weren't able to because it got pushed to
Yeah,
the side or something?
absolutely. So I'll mention a couple of things that were in the class, but not in the book, because In the book, I had, real restrictions of space.
Sure. Yeah.
I just couldn't get as much. So I don't. I sometimes feel like I give the short end of the stick to the original Red Dead Redemption game because my book and my class are really much more about the second game because it's a lot richer of a game, I
Yeah.
have to say.
Yeah.
Of course,
Narratively. Yeah.
I played it first, so it's a little hard, to compare them. But one thing that the original Red Dead does quite well is it explores the Mexican Revolution in 1911. And in my class, I spent several weeks examining what the revolution was about in Mexico and what the place was of the United States in it, right? Because you're John Marston, you're this American guy who's in northern Mexico, kind of caught up in the drama of things. And well, there were lots of Americans who were also caught up in the real drama of the Mexican Revolution. So in the class, I spent a lot of time on this, but in the book, this ended up on the cutting room floor. This was something that I wasn't able to fit in. It just makes the book a lot longer, and it would stray from the sort of foundational U.S. focus of the book. The other thing I was really sad to cut in the book is talking about the Caribbean. Is talking about Guarma.
Yeah.
And Guarma occupies a weird role in the game because it's a very short chapter. It's the only one that's not in the continental US. And from what I gather, a lot of gamers don't love the Guarma chapter. They're kind of like, "What is this? What are we doing here?" It seems like it's underbaked in some ways. I think it's really interesting because, of course, it can help make sense out of another huge dilemma, which is American expansionism and American imperialism, which
Yeah.
is really taking place precisely in that 1898, 1899 moment. And Guarma is weird because, like, part of me thinks it's Cuba, but then again, they talk about Cuba in the game, so it
Yeah.
can't be that.
Yeah.
I don't know. I mean, there's some kind of mashup between
Yeah. And like an
Haiti,
amalgamation.
Cuba, the Dominican Republic. It's a
Yeah.
little unclear, um, but it would have been fun to devote more time to that. But unfortunately, the book is really West, the Deep South, and Appalachia. So I didn't get the chance to incorporate that within the book, which is a shame.
I think the Guarma part interested me because it felt like the entire game, as you know, and as anyone who's played it, is Dutch is sort of leading them on. He's going to take them to the promised land. Like, that's the thing, right?
Yeah,
And as the player, it's a lie. It's not going to happen. And that's the tragedy of the game. Is like Arthur doesn't see that. But so the Guarma
yeah,
part, for me, I liked because it was like they finally. I don't know. It was like that was the moment that they all sort of, okay, we're not escaping. It's over. Like that once they hit
right,
that part. So from a narrative
right.
standpoint,
Right, because they'd been
uh,
dreaming about,
yeah,
either Cuba or Tahiti or something. And then when they get there, they're like, this sucks.
yeah,
This is a big plantation kingdom run by, henchmen of Leviticus Cornwall
yeah,
once again,
yeah,
right? So it's like, even if they leave the US, they can't escape the tentacles of this,
of capitalism, of
Gilded Age
yeah,
robber baron. Exactly.
yeah. What were some
I like
challenge?
the Guarma
Oh
chapter.
yeah. Were there any challenges to teaching Red Dead Redemption to as like a through a prism of history that you didn't
Yeah.
anticipate as you were putting together the class? Was there anything that was there anything that was like difficult or challenging that you didn't anticipate about putting that together?
Yeah, right. Well, so very soon after the class starts, I had to make clear to the students that this was not going to be Red Dead fan club. This is a serious college class that has papers, that has exams, that you got to take notes for, you got to read the books. And I think that became clear very quickly. And of course, there were some disappointed students who were like, wait, I 100% of the game. What? That should mean I 100% the class too. I'm like, nah, man, that ain't gonna happen. So really, what I told the students is, you're not required to have the game. You're not required to own it. You're not required to have played it ever. All that your passion and enthusiasm for the game will give you in the class is enthusiasm for actually learning history as well, right? So like there were no quizzes on who the members of the Vanderlyn gang were, right? Like that's not going to happen because the game is fiction and the class is history.
Mhm.
However, with that being said, I do use the games in every single class, right? Like I talk about topics that are central to the game, and I introduce every topic through cutscenes or gameplay in class. I bring my laptop to class and run it on the projector, which was pretty fun. So it's always there, but still 95% of the class is actually a fairly traditional American history class. But that, students were cool with that. Like they knew that they were getting college credit for it. This was not just going to be, a fan club. This was not just going to be a love fest talking about how much we love the game, even though I do love the game, but the game, it's not history, right? The game is
Sure.
historical fiction, and I want to use it as a way to understand real history, which was bloody, which was violent,
Yeah.
but just for different reasons than are portrayed in the game.
As a professor, when you build your classes, your history classes, and you're teaching about history from the lens of like pop culture, pop music,
Yeah.
pop songs, are there any major differences when you're looking at a different work of art or a different medium like a video game? When you're building those two classes and you're deciding to teach from them, they're both pop culture, they're both, works of art, entertainment, but are there any major differences when you're using them as inspiration to teach a game, teach a class?
Yeah, sure. So I mean, Springsteen's "Born in the USA," which is a song I use a lot in my class. That song is 3.5 minutes long. Red Dead Redemption 2 is like 80 hours long.
Yeah.
So, zeroing in on what material to emphasize is a very different task in this. When you're using video games too, you have to be aware of the fact that games can get dated and antiquated very quickly. Um, Pop culture, music, they have a longer track record, like a song, like Born in the USA from the mid 1980s still resonates, still people listen to it. It hasn't it hasn't gotten dusty in that sense. But video games, because graphics are continuously evolving and changing, games can very quickly grow stale and less interesting to the wider gaming world. But I will say, despite that, the Rockstar games have a longevity that very few other titles do. I mean, the fact that GTA 5, which is now 11 years old, is still like a very best-selling game is
Yeah.
crazy.
Yeah.
So even though I taught my first Red Dead class, I guess it was 3 years after Red Dead 2 had come out, it was still a hugely popular game. And you know what? Today, 6 years after the game came out, it's still hugely popular, and it's still the sales are going up and up every month. So Rockstar games live longer, but I think any historian or any academic who wants to teach with games has to acknowledge this fact that like eventually they'll fade from the what's cool and hot at the moment. Age of Empires 2, interesting game, but like there's not that many people playing it anymore.
Sure. A couple things that I found when I was reading the book that I found particularly interesting. One was how you contextualized the United States and its relationship to guns. I
Yeah.
think a lot of American, and obviously it's like a topic today, and there's lots of debates and stuff. But a lot because a lot of Americans, we understand the country started with a rebellion, so for a rebellion you need firearms. So there's one reason there, but also like I think it's something that seems obvious now, but when I read your book, it wasn't until a professor laid it out in front of me and made it obvious, and I was like, oh shoot, he's right. But like, yeah, at the beginning of American history, not only did you have the Revolution, you had the War of 1812, you had the expansion into the West, you had the Mexican American War. So you had all these wars that were taking place close to the U.S. geographically, and that required a huge arms manufacturing business, right? Like, and I thought that was fascinating to contextualize, like, oh, well, that makes sense because early American history was, I guess, in some part, was driven with guns, like because so much of it,
Yeah.
and so
Well, the
that makes
Civil War
sense. Yeah, yeah,
especially,
and then the Civil
the
War,
Civil
yeah,
War, because so much of it was fought in this sort of guerrilla, non-traditional warfare setting. and that, you're arming both sides
Yeah.
within the US, given that both sides are
Yeah.
Americans,
Yeah.
and that, but I think it's also crucial, not just that America's at war, but that America is pioneering manufacturing technology in this same time period that is making guns much cheaper and more
Hmm.
accessible. So in the book, I really emphasize the sort of the revolution in interchangeable parts, the fact that you can take one trigger from one revolver and place it in identical setting into another weapon to fix it. That was something that was really only began to be possible in the very middle of the 1800s. Before then, if you broke a gun, or, if you broke the hammer on the gun, it's done. Like you might as well just throw it away.
Yeah.
So that really changes and shifts in the 1850s and 1860s.
And I'm sure that probably helps in the context of, I don't know, if you're out in southern Arizona, let's say, in the 1870s, you're probably not around. You're probably not around a gun manufacturer anywhere. So it
Oh,
probably,
they're all East Coast. They're all like in
yeah.
Connecticut and New Jersey.
So
Yeah,
it probably
exactly.
helps that weapons are a little more accessible and like easier to maintain, because if you're out there with a weapon that if it breaks, you're just done, you have to go back to the
Yeah.
East Coast to fix it, then yeah, that makes weapons like less of a tool that's like accessible. But another story I found particularly fascinating that I had never heard of was the story of Robert Charles, who was
Mm.
an African American who lived in, I think it was New Orleans, correct?
Yep.
Yeah, who
Yep.
lived in New
Exactly.
Orleans, and at the time, you had in the South, you had voting rights for African Americans were like continuously being taken away or suppressed in different ways, because this was after Reconstruction, correct? Was it after?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Totally.
Uh, and then you had like the chain gangs, right, where there was this constant threat where people would find a reason to arrest you, and then essentially you would be put back into servitude and slavery in a legal way,
Yeah.
because the 13th Amendment allows for slavery, as long as you're I don't know the words specifically, but as long as you're like a prisoner or in jail or something like that,
Yeah.
right?
Right. It makes an exception. Slavery is illegal except
Except,
for when you're duly convicted of a crime. So it provides that sort of loophole
yeah,
within it.
yeah,
But
but
yeah, in Red Dead Redemption 2, it pays lip service to this, right? You see convict laborers, chain gangs across the South, across Lemoyne in the game. I don't think I've seen them anywhere else in the game, I want to say, but I may be wrong. Um, Now, in the game, they're kind of portrayed as like largely biracial, like about half white, half black. And that was definitely not true in the 1890s because they're
yeah,
almost entirely black in the southern states,
yeah.
which is really shocking. It has to do with that, like you mentioned, the aftermath of slavery and looking to sort of find an alternative to it.
Yeah, to like reinstitute it. But yeah, with Robert Charles, he carried a gun, and he had a, I think it was a uh oh shoot, what's the name of the, it's got a pump on it. What's that called?
Winchester.
Yeah, like a wind. He had it like above his fireplace or something like that, which was common.
Yeah.
And it's, yeah, because and obviously what ended up happening to him is he got into an altercation with police officer, or I guess it would be police officers back then, that were giving
Yep.
him a tough time. And but the point I'm trying to make here is that, again, more context around like Americans and firearms and self defense or whatever. And it's like, well, you could definitely understand Robert Charles's case because he was under constant threat due to his race of being thrown back into slavery. So yeah,
Yeah.
he's gonna be ready to defend himself. Yeah, which I think is
Right. And that,
interesting.
the story of Robert Charles is so perfect to include within the context of Red Dead 2 because Red Dead 2, so much of it plays out in Saint Denis, this
Yeah,
fictionalized New Orleans, and there's all these battles, street battles between these outlaws, the Vanderlyn gang, and the blue jacketed police force of the city, and few gamers would probably believe that 1 year after the game is set, in the summer of 1900, one year after Arthur has his, dramatic voyage through the South, that there's another massive battle between just one outlaw and these police, that leads to crowds that were even bigger than anything that's in the game. But of course, in the game, it's outlaws who are robbing a bank that are pursued. But like you mentioned, Tyler, Robert Charles is this black man who's violently resisting the dawn of Jim Crow, of
yeah,
segregation, of disfranchisement, of just being pushed as into a subservient position in society. And he's like, no, I'm not taking this. I'm fighting back.
yeah.
So in that sense, that violence can help shed light on some of those very biggest dilemmas in Southern history. because the game kind of flattens things out a lot more. I mean, the game does, of course, pay attention to questions of race and
Sure.
inequality, but it never makes them as central as they
Hmm.
actually were in American history.
Yeah.
So I know why, right? I mean, the game wants to be a commercial success. It wants to, it wants to highlight enough stuff so that it can be seen as, thoughtful, but it doesn't want to go all the way because it knows those are very difficult and divisive
Sure. Yeah.
questions.
Yeah. And that's something that is always tricky with a video game because we associate video games with fun. And it's hard to take a lot of those topics and make them fun, right? We talk about this with
Yeah.
like on our podcast and some essays that I've like written and stuff like that. It's like we talk about the difference between like enjoyment and fun. Like if you watch Saving Private Ryan, it is enjoyable, but I don't know if I would describe the experience as fun, you know?
Yeah.
So it's like games have that trouble of how do we, games developers want to make their games fun, but you want to, as an artist, you want to tackle topics that are big and complex, but that can be, those things don't always, mesh. They don't always mesh
Right.
well. And yeah, that's
Right.
like one of the challenges of game design.
Yeah.
So as far as specific, I have some specific questions because as I read through the book, I went back and I played Red Dead and I started like poking at things and thinking, wait a second, I wonder how this was. I wonder if this is realistic. Like I started to,
Yeah.
I guess in my own way, I put on like historian glasses and I was like, like I wonder what I can find.
Yeah.
So in one thing that I'm curious about is in the game, we were talking about guns and their accessibility in the West. In the game, every town has, I think every town has like a gun shop you can go to, and you can buy and upgrade your guns and stuff like that.
Right.
And then for the purposes of the game, I think that's important because players need a place to go to, so they don't have to run back and forth across the entire map to do that. But in terms of how realistic that was, it, if there were the different frontier towns in the West, how common was it to have a store that would just stock guns and ammo? Was that something that was actually common, like all over Western
Yeah.
pioneer towns, or was that not as common as Red Dead Redemption kind of shows it to be?
Yeah, good question. So we have to acknowledge that not all of the West is hyper violent and armed to the teeth. A lot of the West is quite peaceful and very settled, especially in more homogenous communities, like let's say the upper, the northern Great Plains, some of these, Scandinavian American settlements, whether it's in the Dakotas or, Wisconsin or Minnesota. There's some of the most peaceful places in America. It's just, I mean, there's lots of violence in removing native peoples that made it
Sure.
possible for those
Yeah.
Norwegians to come. But once that has happened, these are not so-called frontier boom towns, where violence is frequent. However, in the places where lots of strangers are coming together, particularly a diverse cast of men, that are both white, black, Mexican American, Chinese, that are coming together in these very, unsettled places in these boom towns, like mining, ranching. Um, th there would have been seeing a gun shop would have been totally
Oh, okay.
predictable, because people relied upon weapons to protect themselves in these very unsettled places. So, I mean, I think gun ownership today is likely a great deal higher than it was back then. And certainly the kinds of guns that Americans own today are way more dangerous. But that sort of Hollywood stereotype of, the revolver sticking out of the belt in certain kinds of locations that would not have been that crazy. That would not have been, bizarrely unrealistic. But just don't assume that because in, Abilene, Kansas, you'd see it, that it means that everywhere in the West you'd see it, right? Like some places
Sure.
are much more, tumultuous than others.
What about dueling? Dueling is one of those Hollywood sort of fantasy, the cowboy western fantasy of like the two guys that pull out their revolvers and the first guy to shoot or whatever, and that happens in Red Dead Redemption. Um, was dueling sort of a common thing back then, or have we sort of mythologized how often
Hmm.
it happens, or yeah,
Right.
how often it happens.
I really, I mean, dueling culture was once very real in the United States, but I really associated with it much earlier in the
Mm.
1800s. I mean, think about famous moments like Aaron Burr
Yeah,
killing
yeah,
Alexander Hamilton in a duel, right?
yeah.
Like that was, not common, but it was very familiar to people at the time. In certain parts of the country, dueling culture was more established. The South was particularly, white, well-to-do Southerners were very committed to this. And my sense, and I don't pretend to be an expert on this particular question, but my sense is that by the 1880s and 1890s, that custom was very much fading. That this was not the sort of commonplace affair that it's imagined in Hollywood films. And I got to give Red Dead credit because there's actually very few formal duels in that game. There's a lot of shooting, but the idea that you're walking 16 paces or something and then turning, I don't remember doing that hardly ever in the
Well,
games.
I've played them multiple times, so maybe my memory is colored by playing them so much that it's like maybe it
Yeah,
didn't happen that often, but I've played them so much that maybe I just remembered the same time happening, multiple times. But
right.
um, so in terms of another sort of big question, you talked in the book. You talked about the West as like sort of powering capitalism because you had these giant ranches owned by companies in like Texas, and it's sometimes companies that were outside the United States. You had sort of the meat packing industry in Chicago, right? Which
Yeah,
was sort
huge
of part,
players.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then you had the rail industry, which was also sort of huge. Do you think that as a history professor as someone who knows the West really well, do you think that if we were to understand here, let me ask you this: uh, is our common sort of myth of the American West? Do you think that we have made it more free and uh, sort of separated from capitalism than it actually was? Like in reality, were things actually much were those huge economic forces? Did they actually impose much more control and influence on the region than we sort of tend to mythologize today?
Absolutely. And I can think of a very easy explanation of why that was the case. If you think about the sort of golden age of Hollywood westerns, there's admittedly been many of them, but I would pinpoint the kind of 1950s and 1960s, the sort of John Wayne era of filmmaking. That's during the Cold War. That's at a moment when the US is trying to do everything in its power to distinguish itself from the Soviet Union and to chart its own path, that there's this sort of American capitalism that's free, individualistic, that it does it's not crippled by that kinds of inequalities that the Soviets are always talking about, that communism was meant to emancipate workers from. So they paint this vision of the West that's deeply romantic. That is, the sort of image of the lone cowboy riding into the sunset, marching to his own drum, kind of free to do whatever he wished. If you think about how that maps onto the actual cowboys who worked in the late 19th century, they look nothing like that at all. Right? These cowboys are wage workers for some of the biggest corporations in America, and they often had really crappy jobs, and they often hated their jobs. I mean, most Americans don't know that there were cowboy labor unions and cowboy strikes,
Yeah.
right? Like that's something we've scrubbed from the history of the West. But the reality was that cowboys were pawns in a much larger capitalist system that was very much stacked against them, and was very much dominated by some of those Eastern, or at least Midwestern in terms of Chicago, the Chicago, New York, Boston, London, Edinburgh. Those are the real power centers in American capitalism. And the folks in Texas and Colorado are very much on the receiving end of this system. And they were often pissed about it, right? Like they had real gripes about it. So
That,
yeah, there's a lot, fantasy and nostalgia for very like political purposes has warped our understanding of what actually happened in the West.
how do you think if we were to perceive the West as if that myth had never uh, sort of influenced, if that myth had never come about, and instead
Yeah.
the West was always viewed as a tumultuous region where big company and big money and big economics
And
sort
the
of had
federal
it.
government,
And
I mean,
yeah.
the federal government owns more land in the West than anybody else. So they still do.
How, if we were to understand the West more accurately, how do you think that would change our perception of like American culture and myth? If we were to understand the West as something that was sort of influenced by big economic powers.
Yeah. Well, country music would look pretty different. You'd see fewer cowboy hats, most likely. I mean, I live in Tennessee. This was not really open range ranching country ever, but you see cowboy hats left and right, especially in Nashville, of course. Um, I mean, I think America would need to grapple with a different understanding of what it is. The sorts of national mythologies would look really different. Um, I don't know. It's hard to, it's a real counterfactual exercise to try to imagine
Sure,
a
yeah.
US that doesn't, found itself on this. But I should say that there's a lot of Americans who have not embraced this sort of mythology. A lot of, many women and many non-white folks in the US don't have the same, intimate relationship with that cowboy fantasy because they often know that, well, we weren't part of that story in the first place. So I think it's time that the US embrace a more realistic mythology to understand itself. Is that going to happen? I don't know. Is Red Dead Redemption 2 helping us to emancipate from that? Probably not.
Sure.
But it's a good video game. I mean, that's ultimately all we can ask of it.
In the book, you thoroughly discuss the Wild Bunch, which was a game led by Robert Parker and Henry Longabaugh. I've never pronounced his name. I've only read it, so I think it's Longabaugh or Longabaugh, maybe. I'm not sure.
Longabaugh, yeah.
Okay, so and that's
Like the
AKA
Sundance
yep,
Kid.
Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, yeah, which seems to sort of be perhaps the main inspiration behind the Vanderlyn gang, specifically Dutch
Yeah.
and Arthur. But in the book, you talk about how they were actually averse to killing. They weren't averse to breaking the law.
Yeah.
They did that a lot, but when it came to killing, that was something that they tried to avoid. Why was that? Was it a moral stance? Were they afraid if they did get into shootouts and kill people that would just bring more heat onto them?
Yeah. I think it's a
Yeah,
bit of both, right? So yeah, in the book, I even though I mentioned previously that I didn't want to delve too much into kind of apples to apples comparisons of real life institutions versus game ones, I had to do it for the case of Butch Cassidy and the Wild Bunch because they seem to me the most obvious single inspiration behind the Vanderlyn gang in the video game. And right, so Butch Cassidy was notoriously, I wouldn't say pacifist, but he was quite nonviolent in his techniques. And I think this stems from his Mormon upbringing in Utah. He's really raised deeply in this faith, which, does not condone violence in any way. And then I think that is a very practical thing that he knew that if you shed blood, the chances are that, the authorities are going to pursue you way more vigorously. So it's only in the last year or two of his life when they're like on the run in Latin America that there's any evidence that Butch and the Sundance Kid actually kill anybody at all. However, they did associate with killers. Like there were members of the Wild Bunch that did kill people. It's just the two leaders tried not to do that. This is very different from Arthur Morgan,
yeah.
who at minimum kills 900 people in Red Dead Redemption 2,
Yeah,
which is
yeah.
quite the body count.
Sure, sure. You mentioned the Pinkertons in Red Dead 2, who are sort of one of the game's
Yeah.
villains, and one of the game's representations of modernity, I guess. You have like Leviticus Cornwall, who was sort of who was in the game represents like capital and the changing power structures, and then you have the Pinkertons, who are sort of like the federal government or law enforcement or authority.
Yeah, they're not, well,
Um,
they're not formally the
sure,
government,
yes, you're
they're kind of
correct.
private actors, but
Yeah.
you also, it's also really important that the Pinkertons are pretty much the only institution in Red Dead 2 that's not fictionalized,
Yeah, they
right?
were.
Like
Yeah,
there was no Leviticus Cornwall, there was no, Southern and Eastern Railroad, but there was a Pinkerton
yeah,
National Detective Agency
yeah.
in the 1890s, to be sure.
Yeah. The thing, so the leader Andrew Milton, he's the guy that is sort of the, I guess, the leader of the Pinkertons that are hunting down the Vanderlyn gang.
Yeah.
And one thing that I thought was fascinating was Charlie Siringo was sort of the leader of the Pinkertons hunting down Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. But
Yep.
in history, this isn't a question. This is just something I found fascinating. In
Yeah.
history, Charlie Siringo was sort of cut from the same cloth. He was a cowboy, um, like Butch Cassidy and the Kid.
He's much more like Arthur Morgan than he is
Yeah,
John Milton, to be sure.
whereas in Milton, you don't really know. I don't know if the game gets into what Milton's background, but he doesn't come across as a guy who used to be a cowboy. So in that
No, he's
way,
like a northern bureaucrat.
yeah,
That's what he
yeah.
feels like.
In that way, history is actually more poetic than fiction because you have a guy who sort of intimately knows what the Bad Bunch is doing, and is sent to go after them. And that's, I don't know, that's kind
Right.
of fascinating. That's ironic, right? And there's
The
so
the
much in
the
Red Dead that
most
is.
the most fascinating and ironic thing about Charlie Siringo is that he later turns his back on the Pinkertons and sort of betrays them by writing this series of books that are like the most damning condemnations of the Pinkertons, right? He writes this book called Two Evil Isms. Anarchism and Pinkertonism, so he like slams the agency. The Pinkerton agency despises Charlie Siringo by the end, by the 19 teens. So he's very much a sort of turncoat and comes to hate the Pinkertons just as much as Arthur Morgan does in the game.
Yeah, at the end of the book, you speculate about what a Red Dead 3 could be. It would be
Yeah.
interesting if a potential Red Dead 3, if they did play off that and they did a story about a Pinkerton who sort of flips on the ages. I'm just doing fan fiction now, but like something like
Yeah,
that,
I
which could
like
be
that.
interesting.
Yeah, my sort
Personally,
of vision
go ahead.
my vision
Yeah.
for Red Dead 3 was a sort of, 1870s, like
Yes.
continue moving backwards in time. But I do agree that following a sort of disaffected Pinkerton, a sort of Charlie Siringo, would be really fascinating to see too, and
I
let you get even more revenge on the Pinkertons, right?
sure, but I would say
Though Charlie Siringo doesn't ever shoot them; he just writes
yeah,
books.
yeah. I would say that I like your idea better just because I don't remember the actor who plays John Marston, but I like we
Rob
need
Wiedoff.
yeah, and we need him and Roger Clark again in a game because their performances are just so legendary. Whatever excuses they need to do to bring back Arthur, and the whole and really the entire cast, they just need to do because they need to be
Yeah.
in more games because they're so good. But
They are so good. And it
yeah.
turns out that Roger is a very good audiobook narrator
Yeah,
too.
yeah, yeah. Which I listened to a bit of that, and it was almost surreal because it was like Arthur Morgan. It was because that is how like Roger Clark's voice sounds to some degree. I think he adds a little, a little like depth to it for Arthur Morgan. But yeah,
Yeah.
I listened to some of the audiobook and I was like, this is just Arthur Morgan, and it's so cool. I'll probably play a clip. But anyway,
As your new American history teacher.
yeah, sure. I have a
Imagine
couple.
how surreal it is for me having written the
Yeah.
book and hearing it, like
Yeah.
that's totally crazy.
But before we neatly equate the James Younger gang with the Vanderlyn crew of the video games, let's consider the inconsistencies and flaws in such a comparison. The Pinkerton raid in Missouri took place during a decade when that agency was known for chasing Western outlaws. Yet that decade was not the 1890s, but the 1870s.
Uh, a few more questions here, and I'll let you go. And your big question in your mind, is there one big myth about the American West that sort of still has purchase today that I don't know if bothers you is the right word, but a big myth that you sort of think about a lot and wish you could educate and sort of
Yeah.
upend?
I really hate the phrase Old West because it's sort of, suggests that there's this moment, of chaos and uncertainty and tumultuousness that then comes to an end really quickly. Even Wild West, right? Like it's a phrase that gets tossed out all the time. And it seems to suggest again that there's this sort of like, encapsulated moment in time when the West is really crazy and then it gets all ironed out and everything's all good. Well, that's not true. The West remains wild and remains chaotic and tumultuous well into the 20th century. I mean, you could even argue that today, in the age of unlimited AR-15s, that we're living in another wild West, except the entire country's wild, not just the West. Um, there's, a lot of the most decisive violent showdowns in Western history take place in the 1900s. Think about things like the Ludlow massacre in Colorado in the 19 teens. That's more bloody than any sort of, Wyatt Earp shootout of the 1800s. And it's very much, again, around questions of capitalism, labor, and so on and so forth. So imagining that there's this neat turning point when like the old or Wild West ends or closes, I don't think that there's actually any validity to that statement. And of course, Red Dead 2 does reaffirm the sense, that there's a moment of wildness that is in, closes or ends sometime in the 1890s. And this is a commonly accepted narrative. But if you read Western history, read like what the specialists are saying about it, that doesn't make any sense at all.
Yeah. That was another thing that I found fascinating is, and I think you at the beginning you talked about you immigrated from Sweden, and so you kind of became enamored with American history. But I think American culture is sort of obsessed with figuring out identity and like what America is or means or what it means to be an American or something like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, throughout history, it's like especially with the West, I forget the historian's name. He wrote the paper in the 1890s about the death of the West.
Frederick Jackson Turner.
Yes.
Yeah.
And you sort of debunk it in the book a little bit. And even at the time, there were people that disagreed with it. But again, it was like this fear that America was losing its identity. Again, like this question of who we are because the West was being tamed. And I think that goes throughout the entirety of American history. It's like after World War II, it was like, okay, well, what do we do now? Because we beat the ultimate bad guy, so we have to like find another bad guy. And then, famously there was like I forget the Fukuyama, I think his last name was, that wrote the End of History in the 1990s,
right after the Cold War,
right after the fall of the Soviet Union. So it's like, well, what do we do now? Because what's our identity now? What's the thing that America is? But yeah, like the West is sort of one of those big examples of that. Right now, you're working on your next book, The Global Cowboy: How American Country Music Traveled and Transformed the World. What is this going to be about, and why is that a story that you want to teach and share?
So that's actually going to be book number 4. I am writing a book before then that is also about video games in American history.
Way. Okay.
On
your page on University of Tennessee,
I haven't updated it.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, I haven't updated it.
Well, what is this one going to be about then? Now this is interesting. Are you allowed to talk about it?
I'll speak briefly to it. I was so interested in, it's such a fun time writing the Red Dead history book that it made me, interested whether I could do this for another moment in time. And again, I'm really an American historian, so I'm not writing about Ghost of Tsushima or something like that. I don't know that material. I'd be interested to do so, but that's not me. I'm interested in using another game franchise to explore a more recent moment in time, particularly the last 50 years of American history, the sort of era since the 1970s or so. And what's central to this era is really what I see as this kind of regime of deregulatory free market neoliberal capitalism, which becomes a bipartisan, mantra from Bush through Clinton, Reagan, obviously crucial to it, and up through Obama, and really only first being rejected by people like Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. And of course, Trump has had much more electoral success with that. So I'm interested in making sense of like, how does the United States come to adopt this, really hyper-capitalist free market formula? And to explore this, I'm going to use another franchise by the same developer of Red Dead Redemption,
Interesting. Okay. Well,
which is Grand Theft Auto.
okay, yeah, I was gonna say if you don't want to announce it, it's okay. But I think we can all guess. Well, I'm really excited for that. Is there? Are you? Did you just start working on it? Is there a release date? Again, I know that with you may have working with a publisher, you may not want to talk about hold on. So if you don't want to answer any of these questions,
Right now it's just an idea,
okay,
and it will be a class. It'll start as a class,
okay, awesome,
very similar to Red Dead
interesting.
America. And then I do have interest in converting it to a book as well. So
Oh
stay
man,
tuned.
yeah, that's awesome. I can't wait for that. That's yeah, again, because that is Red Dead Redemption is like sort of about what America was and how it came to be, and GTA was always about what America is in the moment and sort of
Yeah, they're not
and
as explicitly historical, you know?
yeah,
I mean,
sure,
of course, the ones set in 1980s Miami and
yeah,
1990s Los Angeles are, more so, but all of those games are very interested in sort of parodying the absurdities of this particular strain of American capitalist culture.
yeah,
I mean, there are
yeah.
a lot more, and they're often very silly and kind of stupid at times, but um, there's a lot more to them than most people let on. So I'm
Interesting.
hoping there's another teachable moment within those games as well.
Yeah, and GTA 6 comes out within the next year, I think.
Yep,
I think it's going to come
fall
out
of
in the fall.
25.
Yeah, you'll have your work
Yep,
cut out for you, perhaps.
I do indeed. More gaming, more reading, more taking notes on games. So, yeah.
But yeah, so I am interested though, the global cowboy, how American country music traveled and transformed the world. So yeah, what is that going to be about, and what inspired you to tell that story?
Yeah. Yeah. So it's really a story of how American country music came to win fans in unexpected corners of the globe. I'm thinking of West Africa, of Southeast Asia, of the Caribbean, Eastern Europe, and a whole range of other places. The sort of stereotype is that country music is this homegrown American phenomenon that does not travel well. That it's a product of the American white working class, and that's it. That's not true. Not only was country music born from really global influences, but it had a very much a global career, especially during the Cold War years of the second half of the 20th century. So I'm very interested in tracing how musicians travel, how records travel, how music travels via radio waves, and much beyond it, to get a sense that it's not just Hollywood and New York that are the sort of makers of America's kind of global reputation, but it's places like Nashville and Bakersfield and Austin, Texas, that are also part of fashioning American identity on the global stage. A lot of people around the world imagine America with a cowboy hat and a sort of Southwestern accent. And I want to explore how music can help, how music helped make that possible.
Awesome. That sounds fascinating. That sounds really interesting. Well, that's all I have. Thank you so much for joining me. If you have not heard of or you have not read Red Dead's history, go check it out because I loved it. And my only problem with the book is it kept making me want to put it down so I could go play, so I could spot the things you were talking about in the book.
The real
Uh,
trick here, Tyler, is to listen to the audiobook while you're playing the game. Like while you're doing like hunting or fishing or something like
that's a
that. Some kind
great
of
idea.
slow meditative activity.
And it's Roger Clark talking to you as you're hunting, deer or whatever, elk or bear or whatever. Okay,
Who could
awesome.
have known that playing video games could make you a smarter person and a better citizen?
Sure. Yeah, thank you so much again for doing this. I really appreciate it. Yeah, and taking the time to talk Red Dead and some video games.
Cool. Thanks for having me, Tyler. It's been a pleasure.